Hi, I'm Evan B. Howard, and this is one of the video lectures in our series of video lectures on monasticisms, old and new. Today's lecture is entitled, What is Monasticism? And that is the very question I will address here. So let's start with a brief exercise. When you hear the word monasticism, what comes to your mind? What are the first things that come to your mind? So go ahead and pause this video for a moment and write down what you thought. Okay, got that? Good. When I talk to people about monasticism, one of the first things people mention is buildings. Monasticism is monasteries. And indeed, convents and monastic enclosures have been a part of monastic life throughout its history. Now, another thing that gets mentioned frequently is people. Monasticism is people who are usually dressed funny. And indeed, nuns and monks and such are indeed the living beings that make up a monastery. It's pretty hard to have a monastery without nuns and monks. And yes, these folks sometimes dress funny, though not so much now as they did 50 years ago. So nowadays you may be sitting next to a nun in a subway without even knowing it. But monasticism is much more than just buildings and people. Monasticism is, and often people will mention this when I ask them, it's a way of life. Monasticism is above all a life of prayer. But monasticism also includes elements of study and labor and solitude and community and expressions of care. Monasticism is a way of life. My own interests in monasticism began when I was in high school in the early 70s. A friend of mine, she's now my wife, and I went to a movie called Brother, Sun, Sister, Moon. The movie told of Francis of Assisi and the start of the Franciscan order. Okay, it was a kind of a hippie story about the establishment and alternative living. But a new Christian in the 1970s, for a new Christian in the 1970s, this was just the kind of message I needed. Sherry and I have explored semi-monastic living ever since, though we never formally joined any monastic community. We wrote our first rule of life in 1982, and we've kind of been revising it ever since. Over the years, we visited many monasteries from traditional orders, and we've also befriended and visited a number of new monastic groups. I think one of my life goals, actually, is to serve new communities and individual expressions, bringing the wisdom of old monasticism to the life of new monasticism. So, let's get back to the question then. What is monasticism? And why do I keep saying monasticisms, old and new? Well, you see there's a problem here. And it has to do with the definition of terms. Actually, this problem can get really complicated. We can start talking about orders and congregations and societies and friars and hermits and oblates and third orders and then all these different expressions within the Roman Catholic and the Eastern Orthodox and the Coptic and all these different traditions. For now, just for now, let us focus on clearing up just a few key terms. And as we go on further in this lecture series, I'll bring up some of these other terms and clarify them as we go. The technical term, the proper technical term, and frankly it's probably the most encompassing term describing monasticisms and similar expressions like that, is religious life. You might hear, if you're in the proper circles, usually in the Roman Catholic circles, that you ask about someone and they'll say, well, I am a religious. What the I am a religious means is that they've probably taken some kind of a vow to live a life devoted to the service of Christ within the context of some group. Sisters of this, or friars of this, or whatever it might be. Male religious are often called monks. But this is also complicated then by the fact that in the Middle Ages in Europe, a different style and group of religious life developed, where the members of the group did not live in a monastery. They wandered around and they were preaching and serving people. And those men called themselves, and they became known as friars. It actually literally means brothers. And so what you then have are monks living in the monasteries and friars who wander around. And these became known as two different kind of groups of religious. They both had a religious life, but one outside the monastery and another within, as you have monks and friars. In a similar way, we speak of nuns and sisters, but I think actually that the term nun gets used frequently for any woman religious, and even some dictionaries that you look up that define the term nun will define it as inclusive of active and of more contemplative vocations. So then, to make matters worse, when the Protestants reformed their understanding of church, they usually lumped all expressions related to religious life inside the term monasticism or monk, most often with a negative spin, those monks. What this means is that in later centuries then, when Protestants wanted to establish groups or forms of life that bore some kind of resemblance to what we might think of as religious life, they used different terms entirely. Terms like brotherhood or covenant or community or society. So, as you can, so that's the way we're going to work with it. And the term religious life I will use, most often in combination with like monasticisms. That's the way we'll look at this. And as you can probably tell already, the forms of religious life, they actually vary a great deal. I will cover this in further detail in another lecture. But for here, just let me remind you of a few of these forms. Some women, for example, have lived the monastic life and live the monastic life in their own house. Some have done so while living as a wife and mother, while other well-to-do women in the history of the church turned their family estates into convents. Some monks will live their whole lives within the confines of a monastic enclosure, reciting liturgy and copying manuscripts. Still other religious leave their place of residence each day to serve the poor or needy in various ways, or else they'll teach in schools or they'll work in hospitals. Then again, others will live as hermits, living alone and devoting a great deal of time to solitary prayer and meditation. I could go on and on and on, giving you examples of the different forms of monasticism, and we'll get into this in more detail, like I said, later. But you get my idea. Monasticism can look more different than you might think. So, then, if all of the ways of life are different, if all of the terms vary, and also all of the traditions are different, well, let's go back to our question again. What is monasticism? I like to think of Christian monasticism as characterized by a few primary features. Number one, the pursuit of Christ. I call this the formational dimension. Monasticism is about an intentional pursuit of Christ. First, it's Christ. It's Christian. When we're talking about Christian monasticism, there are monasticisms in other world religions. But in Christian monasticism, you're pursuing Christ. You have an identification and affinity with Christ himself, the gospel, the person and gospel of Christ. And also, there's an affinity with a particular sector of the Christian community, this world of religious life that has come up through the history of Christian faith. And it's the degree of that identification that gives, who you identify with and things like that gives monasticisms, old and new, a little bit of its variety. It is not just a pursuit of Christ, it is a pursuit of Christ, though. And this, that's the term, I will talk about asceticism in another video lecture coming up. And it's this aggressive, intentional pursuit that characterizes monasticism. There are people who commit themselves very hard. And that actually brings us to our next point. Pursuit of Christ, number one. Number two, serious commitment. I will call this the intentional dimension. You've got the formational dimension, which is the pursuit of Christ. Serious commitment, which is the intentional dimension. Monks and nuns make formal commitments, usually vows. They have a plan, a written or an unwritten rule, but there's a conscious plan to how we live our lives in this pursuit of Christ. The form, the precise form of that commitment, and the degree of seriousness, you'll have temporary vows, you'll have solemn vows that last for different stages of life. And that's where, again, where the religious life will have a little bit of its variation. The next thing is that, number three, it's a way of life. I call this the order dimension. Pursuit of Christ, serious commitment, way of life. The order dimension. It actually, monasticism has to do not just with our mission, but it has to do with how we live. It's a rule and a rhythm. Usually, a wide range of life is included in this plan. When you go to church, you may all commit to Christ, you may all want Christ, but you don't have a plan for how you eat. You don't have a plan for how you dress. You don't have a plan for what you do at different times of the day. Usually when that reaches a certain stage of commitment and it covers more areas of life, then you begin saying, well, gosh, this is like a monastery. And that's the way it is, because all of life is covered by your rule. There are concrete practices that you do. You have prayers at different segments. And then, the elements of life, or the types of things that are included, the schedules, and even the severity of that'll again give the religious life its variety. The next thing I want to mention real briefly, one of the things in this way of life, which is our next point, number 4, is that monasticism is about particularly a life of prayer. Of all the elements of life that one can include in a rule of life or a pattern, a way of living, prayer seems to get a heavy and important emphasis, usually in monastic expressions. And so we just want to, I call that the mystical dimension. So we'll talk about that as we go on. But both public and private prayer become important in monastic life. Finally, I will call the fifth and final section alternative culture, the identity dimension. Monasticism is a distinction. Monks and nuns distinguish themselves and their way of life from the life of the world, they'll call it. This distinction from the world, undistracted, might be, from the forms of life in the world. Things like employment. I don't have job responsibilities because I focus myself on this, or I focus myself on this, and so I get away from those employment responsibilities. I stay celibate. I don't marry so that I don't have the distractions of family life. I get rid of my possessions so that I don't have to worry myself taking care of automobiles and computers or whatever it might be. Responsibilities, employment, family possessions, you're distinguishing yourself. You're living in an alternative life from the way most people in the world live. But it is also an alternative culture. It's a way of living together. Usually there's some kind of formal accountability to an abbess or an abbot, to a group of people. Even a hermit living entirely alone Usually, they do have contact every once in a while with someone, and even the very call to the hermitage is in response to an Abba, a figure, a guru kind of figure, you might say. So there's accountability. And again, the variations will give the variations of monastic life. So to rehearse those again, monasticism is about a pursuit of Christ, a serious commitment, a way of life, a life of prayer, and an alternative culture. The point in this series of lectures is to learn about and to learn from expressions of religious life within lots of different Christian traditions. And like I said, I will probably use either the term religious life or the term monasticisms to refer to all of this. More particularly, I want to explore in this series of lectures a dialogue between the old or historic expressions of religious life and the new expressions of similar intention that are popping up all over the world these days. I want to bring these two, kind of the old and the new, together in hopes that by looking at them carefully, we can get some neat ideas and some really some inspiring ideas as we seek to live a Christian life in our own settings today. And in the meantime, I hope you have a wonderful day.